Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiridoluale. The headlines. European Union leaders, UN chief discuss Ukraine war, food security and sanctions. ICC concerned by threats over Putin warrant as Russia declares arrest is tantamount to declaration of war. And North Korea claims to have tested a nuclear-capable underwater drone. European Union leaders held talks with UN Chief Antonio Guterres on global food security and sanctions imposed on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, and also endorsed a plan to supply more artillery shells to Kiev. Mr. Guterres' participation in the EU summit came days after he brokered the renewal of a deal on the United Nations and Turkey on the safe export of Ukrainian grain via the Black Sea that is seen as crucial to overcoming a global food crisis. The EU chief executive, the president, Ursula von der Leyen, said any new sanctions against Russia would mostly crack down on circumvention.
Horrible reminder of the darkest times of our history, what's happening there, to deport children. This is a war crime. We know today of 16,200 children that have been deported. Only 300 have returned so far. And these criminal actions completely justify the arrest warrants issued by the ICC. We have introduced the possibility in the 10th package on listing either personalities or companies or entities where we see, also in third countries, that they circumvent the sanctions. So a bundle of measures taken already, but this is certainly not enough, and therefore the 11th package of sanctions will also and mainly deal with the question of circumvention and how we can get against it, go against it. The negotiations are progressing. This is the will. There is the will on both sides to resolve this topic and to resolve it within the scope of the provisional agreement that has been found between Council and Parliament.
EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Meanwhile, Luxembourg's Prime Minister Javier Bettel has called for a more all-around peace plan for Ukraine that might appeal to more sides. Mr. Bettel remained tight-lipped on the question of combustion engines, saying it was not the intended subject of the summit. The official summit agenda covers a broad range of issues from migration to sending ammunition to Ukraine. But last-minute opposition from Germany to one of Europe's biggest climate change policies is looming all over the talks.
Since 10 years, we say that the Americans are more efficient because they have less weapons, they have less production, and so they are able to buy more the same products. And in Europe, it was also the problem that we have a lot of countries producing arms. And so I hope at the end that all the European countries will be able to know that they are part of this project, but to have common projects is also something which could be a solution instead of producing in every single state. On these questions, I'm very neutral. We don't have weapons production in Luxembourg.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged Europe to increase and speed up its supply of weapons to its country, as well as impose additional sanctions on Russia, saying otherwise the war could drag on for years. In a video addressed to the EU leaders delivered from a train, Mr. Zelensky said it was up to the 27-nation bloc to take action to contain Russia more than a year into its invasion of Ukraine. In particular, he reiterated demands for long-range missiles, more ammunition and more modern aircraft, and said the EU needed to speed up the process of granting Ukraine membership.
Хай кожна зустріч, кожна дискусія, кожен день нашої спільної роботи наближає повернення.
If Europe hesitates, the evil may have time to regroup and prepare for years of war. It is in your power to prevent this. It is in our common power to free Ukraine from Russian aggression this year. The more often Ukrainian artillery hits the occupier, the less chance Russia has to implement its genocidal policy against Ukrainians and other Europeans. Despite the fact that every hour on the battlefield matters, the delay in the supply of long-range missiles is already significant for Ukraine. And this does not allow us to push back the positions of Russian terrorists, in particular from Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and our other cities, which are constantly shelled by Russian long-range missiles. Sanctions must be expanded. There can be no hint of delay in sanctions decisions. Moreover,
and former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev says the West dislikes Russia and China's independence, and the coming decades will not be quiet as they will try to break Russia up into smaller and weaker states. In an interview with Russian journalists, Mr. Medvedev, who was former president of the country, said Ukraine was part of a greater Russia and added that he saw no prospects for reviving Russia's ties with the West in the near future. Mr. Medvedev is now deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council and says in a bid by any country to arrest President Vladimir Putin on a warrant issued by the International Criminal Court would be taken as a declaration of war. He also said that the threat of a nuclear conflict is growing and the nuclear parity with the United States and its allies and even Russia's superiority guarantees its integrity, although West strives to break them.
The language is still that of war. We were hoping that there would have been some diplomacy having an impact, but it hasn't yet. So definitely Russia is going on for the kill, or at least for the battle, war. The Ukrainians, of course, they already committed to fight because for them it's a war, a battle of existence. So obviously we are not likely to see an end of active fighting in a very short time. That probably explains why Ukraine is pushing. Zelensky is pushing for equipment, for more resources, assets, which he needs to conduct this fight. So, well, that is a situation that's unfortunate, though.
Now, many people were worried, particularly diplomats like yourself, veteran diplomats who know the possible consequences, intended and unintended, when the president of China, Xi Jinping, went to Moscow to meet with President Putin this week for 2 or 3 days, and a whole host of agreements were reached, although the key one that many were looking out for in terms of Ukraine was not publicized beyond the 12-point peace plan that they had indicated before that meeting. Do you think the diplomats and indeed the countries, particularly in the West, were right to worry that China is now inserting itself into the situation and possibly on the side of the Russians?
Well, the optics will be worrying to the Western diplomats and countries because even though at the time the visit of the Chinese president was seen as one way to, he was apparently trying to present himself as an honest broker that could convince Russia to take a different step. But we also think that it's also possible that they're just trying to strengthen their relationship. Somehow China feels some affinity. Well, we have quite a lot of relations, actually, when compared with the West. China has its also Taiwan problem and so on. So definitely China and Russia want to strengthen relations. Now that is being interpreted in in the Western capitals with some worry. That's obviously the scenario now. So whatever the Russia and China agreed upon, it would largely be to strengthen their relationship, and we don't know whether that would mean to give support to Russia vis-a-vis the Ukraine battle, which would actually be a worry for both Ukraine and NATO and its allies, and the generality of the world, because that would mean a further escalation anyway.
Indeed. The other thing, of course, is that some other countries who are not, shall we say, superpowers, are also finding themselves either willy or nilly in the mix. Take the North Koreans, for example, and the continuing confrontation with South Korea and, by extension, the United States. You've mentioned the Taiwanese, who are now experiencing continued aggression from the Chinese. And then, of course, you have countries like Iran, who have been supplying the Russians with drones, even though they deny this. And the Iranian president was in Moscow not too long ago to visit with President Putin. I raise all these various points, Ambassador, because diplomats like yourself would say, look, it can't go beyond talking. But it only takes one error, error of judgment on the part of one of these actors before everything, blows up in our faces, if you like. How is that panning out?
Well, you already know from the history of wars, past wars, that as opponents agglomerate in groups, formalize for whatever reason, either ideological affinity or proximity or whatever, and we can see that it tends to escalate the situation, and the global community begin to be ranged again in two parts: the people who are for or people who are on one side or the other. I see that happening again, which we know these are all the things that happened before major wars. You can understand why North Korea will be, beating war drums, because it sees America there, and it already has its troubles with South Korea. Iran, we also know where the country stands. So it's unfortunate, but that is a natural occurrence when you polarize. Well, the world countries are polarized against people who stand for what and so on. And incidentally, a war is already on ground. That is the Ukrainian crisis. And gradually, every group, except perhaps for probably people who are countries that are in Africa or foreign, but they will be ranged against themselves and waiting and probably fanning the embers of war further. So that's, of course, the challenge. What can we do?
That's the question. So I want to ask you, what can we do at this point, Ambassador? You and I had discussed this for most of 2022, and we were looking to players like Turkey and possibly the United Nations, especially after the grain deal was negotiated, in the hope that that could then become the basis for something wider. That hasn't proved to be the case. So who can we look to? Because it looks like everybody we were looking to then has either become a fellow combatant in the war or has proved, not to have what it takes to bring them to the table. Yeah, well, we were looking, Turkey and all those, they did their best. They haven't given up, but in between, Turkey not too long ago had its own domestic challenge with the earthquakes and so on. Of course, when it comes to the issues of supply, grains, I'm sure the world is managing to find its food here and there, or fuel here and there.
But of course, that doesn't change the main incubus, the fact that a war is going on, the two combatants are not letting off, they are probably not easily or quickly seeing one of them defeat the other one crushingly to the point that it surrenders. We probably are not going to see that immediately or in the immediate future, especially if the NATO allies keep supporting Ukraine. So, well, sadly, I would say that the matter would continue like that for probably another 1 year. The only solution, really, as of course we've in the past pointed this out, that the person, the country, or the group that started this war by leaving its shores or territory and crossing into another territory, and also has had the power to continue in that aggression, is the one that will have to move backwards. Because once it moved backwards, there wouldn't be any more fight. I mean, Ukrainians wouldn't fight here. So the question is back: do you convince? Do Russia's friends convince Russia to withdraw? Do Russians' enemies force Russia to withdraw? Do Russian citizens convince their leader that there isn't any need further for this war? So these are three scenarios.
Scenarios that could play out. Thank you so very much indeed, Your Excellency, Ambassador Joseph Ayalogo. Thank you as always for the time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.
And after the break, Ukrainian army retracts report on Russian pullout from Kherson town. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. The Ukrainian army has withdrawn a previous report saying Russian forces have left the town of Nova Kakhovka in southern Kherson, indicating that the Russians were still there. The army said on Telegram, quote, information about the alleged withdrawal of the enemy from this settlement was made public as a result of incorrect use of available data, unquote. And China's military says it tracked and warned away a United States warship that had illegally entered waters it claims in the South China Sea. The U.S. Navy denied China's claims, stating that the ship was on a routine operation and left the area of its own accord. In a statement, the Southern Theater Command of the Chinese People's Liberation Army said the USS Melius, a guided missile destroyer, intruded into waters around the disputed Paracel Islands. The spokesperson for the Southern Theater Command, Tien Jolie, said the PLA organized sea and air forces to track and monitor the ship in accordance with the law and warned it to leave. The U.S. vessel made an illegal incursion into Chinese territorial waters without permission from the Chinese government, harming peace and stability in the region, according to the statement. And Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin says Western sanctions against Moscow target ordinary people. Mr. Mishustin said in an address to the State Duma, and I quote, "At the very beginning, the West tried to assure us that the sanctions were not directed against our citizens, and then there were no illusions about this. But now even a person from global politics understands that the main goal was the Russian people." Mr. Mishustin said Moscow was hit by sanctions of an unprecedented scale that, as a result, provoked mass unemployment. And China has been praised for showing the world the true meaning of democracy. At the second International Forum on Democracy with the theme, The Shared Human Values, speakers from across the world said imperial governments, that is described them, have sought to suppress and relegate other models of democracy, which has proven more harmful than helpful for many countries under their influence. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Amarachi Ubani reports from Beijing, China.
It is one thing for Chinese government officials to praise the leadership of President Xi Jinping, but it's even more interesting when that praise comes from politicians across the globe.
What is the point of a cat, black or white, if it doesn't catch any mice? Your system is the one that is moving forward. Therefore, to what extent is our democracy superior to yours?
Here at the Second International Forum on Democracy, speakers were very intentional about their commendation for China's progress in the last 20 to 30 years, attributing it to the country's model of democracy and condemning what they called imperialist arrogance.
Today they cannot accept the fact that China has caught up with them. China is about to surpass them in many areas of human endeavor. The imperialist arrogance is inhibiting them from accepting that reality. The racist arrogance is inhibiting them from accepting that reality. But the world is changing.
As Chairman Mao announced on October 1st, 1949, when the People's Republic of China emerged, and I quote, "The Chinese nation has stood up." He announced it in Tiananmen Square that China and the Chinese people are masters of their own destiny. And this has to be the essence of democracy, that people decide their own future, their own destiny by themselves.
It was a praise fest for China, as speaker after speaker condemned Western democracy, which they said lacked democratic values, was self-serving, and caused citizen distrust in democracy. No one country, they said, should impose its style of democracy on another.
It must be said that very, very few countries, if any, can call themselves truly democratic. Even in the West, where many countries have boasted that they have had long established democracies, they're also struggling with a number of challenges. In many countries, the issue of money politics and corruption has eroded faith in government and democracy, where the rich and wealthy can wield influence over policies, often at times at the expense of the majority of people.
Government needs capacity, professionalism, the ability to plan, the ability to understand the changing needs, whether it is because of environmental challenges or technological changes. So government capacity, expertise, planning, directed towards the common good is a core part of decent and necessary governance.
The Second International Forum on Democracy comes ahead of the Summit for Democracy 2023, holding in Lusaka, Zambia next week, sponsored by the U.S. Department of State and USAID. It is expected to showcase the role of cities and subnational governments in its affirmation of democratic values and renewal of democracy worldwide. With the China model firmly in the running as an alternative to Western-style democracy, leaders will be watching which side addresses their interests the most. Here in Beijing, China, Amarachi Ubani, Channel Television News.
Let's talk to Ini John McQuarrie of our business desk. Morning,
Good morning.
Ini.
Good morning.
Thanks for being with us. The U.S. Department of Justice is currently investigating financial professionals at Credit Suisse and UBS.
Yes, another hit may be coming the way of Credit Suisse just when we...
Didn't they just get bailed out?
Yes, they did. And in fact, even that still has its own consequences because they got so bailed out that they are now so big. In fact, some papers have described them as too big for the Swiss economy. And they are killing competition. So because they are now so strong, the other banks are now too small to compete with them. So it's actually causing a problem in Switzerland. But that's on the one hand. For Russia now, what we see is Credit Suisse, at the height of it, made a profit of about $500 million
from dealing with
Russian oligarchs. So that's a major for them. As of May, they were holding about $33 billion belonging to Russian big guys in Russia. So yes, they did agree that they were going to stop doing business with Russian. But I mean, when you have a profit of $500 million, you might find a way. You might find a way to start to keep some of the business. So I think the Department of Justice of the United States may have heard or have been hinted on some of those businesses still going on, so they are now under scrutiny, the scrutiny of the Department of Justice, as well as the UBS. Even though, I mean, the UBS, their profit is not so much compared to Credit Suisse. So I mean, if they get sanctioned,
that will only add to a pile of troubles that are already stacking up.
Exactly. But it might also be good competition for the other banks in Switzerland. Remember, I started by saying
that these ones have become too big for the others. Okay.
Yeah, so it might bring a kind of a balancing act, but I mean, it may not be good for the financial sector generally globally.
Yeah, because Credit Suisse is a
very big,
huge whale. And the United States is intensifying efforts to build a relationship with Africa. Let me hear you.
Kamala Harris is coming to Africa next week.
Right.
And she's going to go to Ghana, neighboring Ghana, going to Tanzania, and I think Zambia. Not coming to Nigeria, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I don't know which way we want to look at it. But I mean, we've seen China and the United States and Russia scrambling
for Africa.
If I can use that word.
Some uncharitable comments have linked it to the previous scramble, which led to colonialism and all of that.
So it's something we've discussed here before, that, I mean, Africa is a newborn baby, sort of, when you look at the developed world, because we have a lot of untapped potentials. That is obviously why we're getting so much attention. But what we do with that attention is going to determine the future. Yeah, it's going to determine the future of Africa. We're going to go back to being colonized by this guy, because sometimes it seems Africa just, oh, this is freebies, so they want to give us money, let's grab it. They want to give us this, not looking at the undertone. They don't take a look at the chain that is behind the money. They call this the tiny print.
That's always a problem. And of course, one of the things that had made Africa a center point is not necessarily good in terms of production and so on, is this issue of food. Yes. And the fact that a great deal of African countries are importing the vast bulk of what they eat.
Sadly, Nigeria is the global highest producer of yam.
Yes.
What are we doing with it? What are we doing with it?
And all the possible byproducts that can come from
that. Come from that. Palm oil. Nigeria is the biggest in Africa. What are we doing with it? Now, the price of palm oil is also moving, because they have countries like Malaysia, they have their weather issue, they have their festival,
So there's pressure on demand. It's on supply, rather.
Yes.
And the demand is still quite high.
But what are we doing with it? So these are some of the things that it seems Africans are overlooking, and
in this courtship by everybody else. Now, export prices of wheat, incidentally, that's what we just talked about. Export prices of wheat from the EU remain largely steady over the past week, in spite of the fact that because the grain deal is still relatively uncertain.
So the thing is, farmers in Europe close to Ukraine are not having it very good at this time because of the concession that has been given to Ukraine. So everybody's trying to help Ukraine. Yesterday, we talked about how UK is trying to attract business people to Ukraine, removing tariffs and all of that. So what has happened is the Black Sea grain is good for Europe, because then they can transport Ukraine's wheat to outside the Europe. But when that deal is not there, then because of the assistance they want to give to Ukraine, then wheat and other grains coming from Ukraine is being sold to European countries at very cheap prices. So the farmers in Europe and they are not.
Yeah, of course, that suppresses their own prices as well.
Yes, exactly. So
those
that's
who
why,
produce in Europe.
So that is why, even though there's demand, the prices in Europe and all of that, and EU, they're still suppressed. They're steady or they're going down and all of that, because there's a whole lot of supply coming from Ukraine. And what the zone is trying to do is to assist Ukraine. So they prioritize the grain coming from Ukraine. So that way, farmers are suffering. Now, they've been promised a kind of aid and all of that, but that's not coming up until September. What do they do
What
until
do they
September?
do between now and September?
They have their produce. A lot of them are used to selling to only European. They don't know how to do the export and all of that.
Outside of the country.
And the logistics and transportation that is involved in that in the midst of the war.
And that absolutely the key point. the last listener you made there. Thanks, Ini. Of course, Ini and her crew, of course, will be back in the course of the day. Right after this program, first with Business Morning, and later on with Business Incorporated. Thank you, Ini.
Thank you so much.
Let's use the opportunity and talk to Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain, national defense and military strategist, who joins us from Abuja. Captain Johnson, thank you for your time. Welcome. Captain Johnson, can you hear me? Good morning.
I can hear you. I can hear you. Thank you very much, and good morning.
Good morning. I wanted us to take a look at strategy this morning. We have talked previously about the movements on the field. Now, Ukraine is about to receive fighter jets from some of the countries that have broken ranks with the rest of NATO and the EU to supply Ukraine with some of these jets. But then there have been those who have pointed out that the jets are not necessarily of the quality that Ukraine could use against Russia. I mean, we are talking about MiGs here, and MiGs are Soviet-era aircraft and difficult to maintain. And coming up against Russia's own top-of-the-line fleet, they might not be completely effective. What do you think?
Yeah, I think those who are saying that, the MiGs will not be that much effective against, fifth generation fighter jets that Russia is in possession of are very correct. These are Soviet era fighter jets that even the Russians themselves are not relying, so much on. So to send those MiGs to go and compete against these, fifth generation, even sometimes sixth generation fighter jets, is, to me, sometimes I see it as maybe being suicidal. I think what the West and the NATO can do for Ukraine is to provide them, top-the-line fighter jets that will be, combat effective and go toe-to-toe with what the Russians have in their possession. Yes, those who are saying that it may not necessarily be effective against the Russians, to me, I believe they are correct in their assessment.
Now, but then on the other hand, as we can see on the screen, tanks are also part of what Ukraine has said it needs, and that it has received promises of. Again, these are of two types. You have the Leopard 2 tanks, which are coming from Europe, and then you have the more sophisticated Challenger and Abrams tanks, which are coming from the UK and from the US. Now, the ones coming from the UK and the US will probably take longer, but the Leopard tanks, we are told several of them have already arrived. In fact, the visuals that we're seeing on the screen right now, show the arrival of some. Do you think these will make a difference?
Absolutely. There is no way they wouldn't make a difference. Even the Russians themselves know that they will make a much difference, because as at the time that these countries had agreed to send these weapons to Ukraine, you could see the Russian objection, because they know that some of these tanks that they're bringing from the West are more effective than what the Russians have in their arsenal right now. So yes, these tanks are going to make a difference. Now, there are some caveats to it, in the sense that you're bringing in multiple tanks from different countries. All these tanks, they have their own spare parts. So logistics, procurement, and all of those things are going to be a challenge. and even training, because all these tanks have their own different dynamics. So the soldiers will have to train on all of them to be able to effectively utilize them. Because one thing is to have all these sophisticated weapons, and another thing is to be able to operate those weapons to your maximum advantage. Although the Ukrainians have shown the ability to be able to master all these weapons within a short period of time, based on the information that we are hearing, particularly if you look at the Patriot missile system. I was reading the other day that the U.S. is almost ready to send that to the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians have already mastered the use of it. So if that is the case, that may reduce the challenge of training with the soldiers.
The other thing, of course, is that, I mean, if we stay with the issue of the tanks, the Challenger tanks, I mean, you being a retired U.S. Army veteran, when we talk about the Abrams tanks, the literature is that these are some of the most, if not the most sophisticated tanks, that exist anywhere in the world. And therefore, mastering them is one thing, but as you pointed out, maintaining them, even when you master them, is an entirely different ballgame, which was why the Americans were reluctant to send them in the first place. That's number one. The other is that, of course, there's the fighting vehicles that were also promised by the U.S. to Ukraine, some of which are in the process of getting sent, the Bradley fighting vehicles, to be precise. Now, again, these are extremely sophisticated.
Yes.
Yeah, these are sophisticated equipment. Do you think, these kinds of levels of sophistication could make a difference to Ukrainians who, as you say, quick to master, but can they maintain them? I don't know if you can hear me.
The maintenance issue has been the concern of most experts, is if they will be able to. I can hear you. I can hear you.
Please go on. Please go on.
Yeah, the maintenance aspect is one concern that a lot of experts have been worried about.
We seem to be having some difficulty with Captain Johnson's connections. Okay,
and
back.
This Abrams, they be used in places like airport and what is required to make it. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go on. Please go on. Please go on.
Okay, so yeah, the concern for maintenance is a legitimate one, because those concerns are based on experiences of the use of these highly sophisticated equipment, particularly the Abrams in the field. Even though the Abrams origin is the United States, but there is still that challenge of being able to maintain them. It's a very bulky weapon, requires constant maintenance to be able to keep it operational. So yes, I don't know what provisions or arrangement has been made by the West to make sure that these equipment are maintained and that the Ukrainians are trained to be able to maintain this equipment, since NATO is not sending any soldier on ground in the Ukraine. So it will have to now be on the Ukrainians to be able to maintain them. And for that to happen, they have to have that level of training from the various places where all these tanks are coming from, so that they'll be able to maintain them if they are supplied with the right spare parts. So yes, it's a legitimate concern.
Indeed. Captain Bish Johnson, thank you so much for your time on the program this morning. We do value your input.
Thank you very much.
The Turkish Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee has approved a bill ratifying Finland's bid to join NATO. The bill still needs to be approved by the Parliament's General Assembly. Sweden, which applied to join the bloc simultaneously with Finland, has yet to be approved by Turkey. But meanwhile, Sweden's Prime Minister says he will seek an explanation from Hungary on why the ratification of his country's NATO membership is being delayed, while Finland's is expected to be approved next week. Helsinki's and Stockholm's NATO applications were accepted simultaneously at a June summit of the military alliance, but the bids need to be ratified by all 30 NATO members, and Turkey and Hungary have yet to do so. Prime Minister Viktor Orban's ruling Fidesz party has said Parliament will ratify Finland's bid on Monday, but will decide on the case of Sweden later. And finally, on the program, U.S. President Joe Biden's arrived in Canada overnight for a two-day visit in which he's expected to discuss migration, security and energy with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. The two leaders and their wives met privately at Mr. Trudeau's residence shortly after Mr. Biden and the First Lady Jill Biden landed. On the eve of the meeting, a U.S. official and a Canadian government source said the United States and Canada had reached a deal aimed at stopping asylum seekers from entering their shared land border via unofficial crossings, though some details still need to be ironed out when the two sides meet. Mr. Biden arrived on his long-delayed visit to express unity on Ukraine and is expected to address Parliament with Mr. Trudeau in attendance. That's our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akiri Duluale. Do have yourselves a great weekend ahead. Good morning.